Each of you, just to start out the same question, and then I have some specific ones. Could you, each of you, say, maybe Rick, you would start, when did you first read Thomas Bernhard and what drew you to his work?
That was the first book I read, and it was given to me by a writer friend right after I was in graduate school at Columbia, who just said, "You're going to love this work." And I think the reason she suggested it was because I had a taste for sort of subversive and provocative prose, and my sort of biggest college hero was Beckett, and I think it's right to sort of draw some kind of connection between the two of them, though their themes are so different. So I read Woodcutter's first, was incredibly taken with it, and I sort of then at that point went and got every single book by him you guys had done, and sort of marched through, from beginning to end. The work was so hugely influential for me that I actually made a decision to stop reading it. And I think in 91 or 2, I stopped, and this is the first time I've read it since that time, actually. I mean, in the 4 or 5 years that I was reading it, I read it so thoroughly that I felt like I had sort of absorbed its genetic material almost. But then I stopped, and still think of him as one of the most influential writers for me in terms of my own development and finding my own voice and so on.
And I picked up Old Masters just sort of on impulse, which was the last book he wrote. It was a book that he actually hadn't even planned to write. He finished Extinction thinking it was going to be the last thing that he ever wrote, and as often happened in his life, the sort of sentence of mortality he received from his doctors was given a minor abatement, and he knocked out one more novel, which is my sentimental favorite, I think. It's a novel about a very old man who's lost his wife, who's been with him his entire life, and Bernhard had been with a woman. I didn't discover this until much later, but Bernhard had been with the same woman for 30 or 40 years, and she essentially, was his everything. Without her, he would not have been able to write a word. And after she died, shortly before he did, if I'm remembering correctly, he, just was really heartbroken and full of grief. And when we think of Bernhard, we think of this as a man who's full of rage and not full of grief. And maybe it was because I saw Bernhard first really through this book, which is just such a tremendously sad, luminous book about losing someone that you love. Someone that you devoted your whole life to. I was just reading about Joyce Carlos's A Widow's Notebook, or what's it called? That's come out. But this sort of particular experience of really not just being married to someone for 40 years, but building your entire life around them. And the book just pulsates with sadness, and I was just immediately hooked on it. And then, exactly like Rick, I went out and bought everything that was available in English and simply consumed it for the next 2 or 3 years.
In about 1970, and I was absolutely fascinated because this voice was not like any other voice that you could find in German writing, and the sheer force of fury that came out of the first book that I read really stopped me in my tracks. He was doing something that nobody else was doing. As I learned more about him, I could see immediately the connection to music. It's a curious sense to have about a writer. Of course, the composer you immediately think of if you're a Bernhard lover is Bach. And the ability to build not just sentences, he almost has no respect for sentences, but vast tracts of prose in a manner that is both percussive and thematically playing and developing and turning back on itself and moving, is very much the music of the piano, and the piano is of course a percussive instrument. And I hadn't seen anyone else before, I think, who was able, some people don't think it's entirely a gift, almost to knock out the meaning of words and connect them in an abstract way to music. You can read passages of Bernhard where you're absorbed with where the language is going, and you're hearing the rhythm, you're hearing the beat, you're hearing the obsession, you're hearing the repetition. You almost don't notice at times what he's saying. It's how he's saying it. And this is a strange but fascinating way to use language and capacity. To see German used like this is startling enough. To try to do it in English is a translator's nightmare, because English doesn't want to do this. The music of English is completely different. Every instinct that you have in English is completely different. And so I can only send up once again all the honor that I have for the translators over the years who've done Thomas Bernhard for me, because it is brutal. It is absolutely brutal. Just as the piano is a blood sport, the piano is an enormous instrument. Bringing yourself to translate Bernhard's German is like being confronted with a certain kind of a rock face. But you've got to figure out how to do it, how to make it work. And I hope it's, obviously, 2 people here have found that it did work sufficiently in English. But I can't go on, I must go on. Has been my editor's motto. as much as other people. You have your loyalties to your authors. You have a sales force that wishes you didn't, because this is not material for your average book sales force. But you keep on going, and I did. And there was this great long pause, of course, after Bernhard died. The reason that my prizes came to us so late is that the manuscript was there. He'd edited most of it and polished most of it. It was sitting there in his papers. And it was only 2 years ago that his brother, who is his executor, decided to release them and told Zucker that they could publish. Hence that long silence.